All right. Welcome back, everybody, to Future Focus, where we are living at the intersection of business technology and the human experience. Today, I am going to be getting into it with Brian Nelson Palmer, and we are going to be talking about how to optimize our productivity, which I think with as much as people are stretched thin, burned out, trying to figure out how to navigate everything that's going on with technology, I thought this was such a relevant and timely topic, especially coming into the beginning of 2024. And we're going to do it in a very human-centered way. So just as an early teaser, if you're coming here to go, hey, how can I be more productive so I can just jam more crap into my day? That's not really the conversation we're going to be having. So Brian, thank you for joining me.
Christopher, thanks so much for having me, man. It's a treat to get to join you and talk about this, because I mean, I talk about this professionally, but to get to jam with you and I both kind of live in this intersection of this topic. So to get to jam with you about it is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's going to be a blast. And we did. How long has it been since we did it? I was on your podcast. It was a while ago, right?
Yep. Spoiler alert. I'm also the host of Productivity Gladiator, which is a podcast. And if you want to check out the episode that Christopher and I did, it was on AI and productivity stuff with AI. And that might have been the middle of 2023 was when that episode.
It was like mid-year last year. So now it's fun because now we're flipping the mic. So now you're on my show. So now you're in my house. And now we get to talk about all sorts of stuff all over again. So this is going to be a good time. So for those who may not be as familiar with who Brian is, why don't you give people a little bit of a download of who you are?
Sure. I am the founder and creator of Productivity Gladiator, which is I basically do training and development for, it's personal, practical productivity skills and life balance skills for my target audiences. Early career project managers and aspiring leaders are the two groups that I tend to train the most. And ultimately, businesses bring me in to train their folks. And in exchange, you end up with about a 50% increase in the personal productivity, but also a 30% drop in the turnover, just because part of what I teach is the life balance piece. So like Christopher, you were alluding to it earlier, like I don't just give you a bunch of hacks that let you do a bunch more, but it's also a very consistent focus on, okay, what do you do with, now you have that ability to do a little more. What do you do with that? And the answer is not like I do a whole session on life balance. And what is that? And how do you get that? What does it look like?
Which feels like a squishy thing, but it's not. Sometimes it's perceived as this like, oh, that's like squishy. And it's like, no, actually, even if you're talking gladiator, so we can talk fitness stuff. But I mean, this is true with like fitness. If you don't rest, you actually will be weaker and not as fit, because your body actually needs rest in its rhythm. So going back to productivity, if you're just cramming more in, you're actually fatiguing yourself to a point where you're actually less valuable.
And the thing that I've noticed too, that in part of what I teach in my training is oftentimes life balance for many people is they describe it as a feeling, right? All of a sudden you just feel like, oh, my life balance is kind of off. Like I feel
good about things.
And let's be real. Here's the quote, right? You'll probably remember this one. If you forget nothing else, remember this quote, which is, people don't struggle with work-life balance because they life too much. It's because they work every time. And so it's, what does that actually look like?
I don't know that I've ever heard anybody where they go, I'm really trying to get my act in order. I am so busy with life. I need to really spend more of my time on work. I don't think that's ever a balance that I've encountered somebody having completely out of whack. Maybe in your early 20s when you get your first job and you're kind of figuring life out or something like that.
Yeah. That's it. And so like I have a plan. We actually deliver, you have a life balance plan at the end of the training. And like, this is what it looks like for you. And so it's getting into that stuff where, it's email inbox to zero. We do that too. And like, how do you handle, where do you keep track of your tasks and having a system for that? I teach skills and tools that are very practical for the person, because for me, it's about the person as a whole, right? So the skills that I teach you are things that you use at home and at work. It's applicable to both, because we level up the person, and by leveling up the person, the business benefits and the person benefits and everybody wins. And so that's the focus of what I do with Productivity Gladiator.
Okay. Well, and that makes sense in general. I think over the past few years, especially, and I think this is a good thing, we've worked on integrating lives and recognizing the fact that there isn't like I have my work life over here and then I have my life over here. And they're these two different worlds. And what I do in one has no effect on the other because
Right.
it just doesn't work that way. I mean, everybody can relate to that. You had a spat with your spouse the morning before you go out to, you show up at work different. If you are a mess with your productivity at work, you bring it home and it affects everything else. So fixing one in one area, it's not like, well, that's my work thing that I corrected. Okay.
Absolutely.
Now,
Yep.
background wise, how did this, was this like a field that you've always focused? What's the journey that you were on to get here? Was this, did you grow up as a kid and go, you know what, someday I'm going to have a warrior themed, training business to help people make better life decisions?
I can say this one for me started when I was 4 years old, and this isn't going to be one of those stories where I tell you that
Oh, wait, you're legit, right?
training gladiator, whatever. But no, here's what happened. When I was on my 4th birthday, I was diagnosed with insulin-dependent diabetes. And so
Okay.
I will never forget sitting in Dr. Kinsella's bland 1980s stuffy office and learning that while diabetics can live a full and normal life, the life expectancy for diabetics is 10 to 20 years shorter than everyone else.
Okay.
And so now as an adult, like growing up as a kid, time was I took time for granted. And then teen and college years, I started to recognize this time is the one thing I can never get back. And now as an
Okay.
adult, time is the most precious thing that I have. And so for me,
Okay.
I have lived my life thinking, and not because, by the way, treatment for diabetes, I'm not telling you this because I think I'm going to like die tomorrow. Treatment for diabetes has come a long way, but it definitely is something that I have always kind of lived with. How do I do this life thing the best way I can to maximize the life that I have now? Because I'm probably not going to have a super long retirement based on what this is, whether that's true or not. I'm trying to live my best life. So that's where it started. But then professionally, I have always been an instructor. We joked about
Okay.
Gladiator. I mean, I teach group fitness classes 4 times a week. I'm in the gym.
All right. So the fitness analogy was not lost on you then either.
It's not lost on me. That's something, but this is about, I used to teach the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People training courses.
Yep.
And
Okay.
I've got a Lean Six Sigma. I've got all my belts in Lean Six Sigma. And so it's like the personal and professional improvement thing has been my career. And so later in life, Productivity Gladiator came around because I wanted to share this. What I found is that this stuff, my friends were like, gosh, Brian, how do you do it all? I mean, I've had a lot of opportunities to do some really cool. I mean, right now I have 4 jobs. That's not because
and we are not setting that as the expectation for everybody who listens, that that's what you should aspire to.
But that's no, that is not I'm not saying that's a good idea for everybody, but I do 3 of them. One of them is the one that pays the bills, the main one.
Yep.
And the other 3 are things that I'm so passionate about, and I also get paid to do them. And that's part. And so it's like, all right, so I have a system for this, and how do I share that with people? And can I actually teach that system to other people? And that's where Productivity Gladiator was born. And I started teaching my friends, and then they referred me to other people, and now it's become a business, and I love it. I truly enjoy getting to have conversations like this and talk about this stuff and teach this stuff. Oh man, it's so fun. So for me, this is a passion more than just a job or a business.
What's interesting, going back to your story, you're probably, I think, in 4.5 years, the first guest who, when I joke about, was this like a childhood aspiration? I think you might be the actual first guest who was like, actually, yes, it is. I mean, not exactly like, but actually, yes, it goes back to when I was 4. That's a first for me on here. But one of the things that resonated with me on there is, so I grew up, both my parents were funeral directors. And so I was surrounded by the reality of mortality. And so very similar to you, when you have a keen awareness of your time being limited, you just look at the world differently, because all these things that it's so easy to just be like, well, I got to do this. And time flies by. And next thing you know, you're out of time. You have a different lens on going, yeah, I don't ever want to be in that boat where I look back and go, oh, shoot,
Yeah.
Shoot, I completely missed the mark on that one.
That's it. I had the opportunity I did a TEDx talk a little while back. If you want to check me out, you can certainly look it up. But the thing that kind of resonates with what you're saying too is that, and I shared some of this in that talk, is that the talk was on the live like you're worth the value of your time. And how do you do that? And so it's actually a lesson. It's a very good takeaway you'll get from something from the talk. But it was also, to me, it was a good resonator because that was a TEDx talk. And if you don't know much about TEDx talks, TED is the organization and TEDx are like individual talks. And so your talk gets uploaded on the YouTube channel. And the team at TED, they get like 500 talks a day that get uploaded to this channel. And the team at TED picked my talk out of the 500 or so as this is an editor's pick and like this is a good lesson. And so they kind of featured it. And so it, got a whole bunch of views and likes and all that stuff. And it was a wonderful experience. But for me, it was also validating because the concept that I talk about in that talk is the stuff I've been teaching in Productivity Gladiator for years. And so it was just validated. I didn't submit for that. I didn't ask for that. I didn't, have it nominated. It was just, I just did a talk and then they saw it and they liked it and they made it a pick. And so it just continued to validate that like,
it is
I
nice
wanna
when you
keep
get
hearing
those
it.
occasional validation points that like, okay, at least what I'm doing it's on the right track and it's not just
Yes.
noise type of a
Right.
thing. Okay.
Yeah. Because there's a
So
lot of
as you look at there is a lot of noise, and I will say as technology has become more accessible, there's even more noise because
big time.
just about anybody can create anything on anything. So yeah, which there you go. There's a productivity hack in and of itself is be careful what you get sucked into because you can find yourself wasting way too much time
True story.
consuming just absolute garbage.
Yeah.
As you look at this though, and as you look at kind of one of the things I'm curious about, as you look at um, trends or things that you've been seeing, you've obviously worked with a ton of people on this. What are some of the biggest barriers or things that people run into that like when you encounter a group of people, are there consistent themes where you do find certain things that consistently people are like, holy crap, I've been stuck on this treadmill and I didn't even realize I was there?
One of the main ones that comes up in my mind right off the bat is that, and you're probably going to laugh when I say this, but you are your own barrier. And a lot of these things are, I mean, I can teach you all the hacks. We can talk productivity hacks for days. But if all you do is listen to them and you think, oh, it's a good idea, and you don't actually
I really
do
should do
any of
that.
yeah, I really should. Oh, man. Oh, gosh, Christopher, I have a really funny story that I can share. Oh my God, my wife will smack me if I'm going to tell you the story anyway. So
Okay.
I've been using AI consistently since it launched because you and I talked about it on our episode on Productivity Gladiator. It's like a brilliant
Generative
intern,
AI.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, generative AI. It's a brilliant intern. So I can go on ChatGPT or whatever, Bard or all the different ones, and it'll give me things. It'll help. And the thing is, people often hear these things, but like you said, there's so much noise that it doesn't ring true. So one of the things that's really helpful, and as an instructor, it's important, is giving examples that are applicable to you so that you get it. So you as the learner, if you're checking this out, please do, if you're in training, make the instructor give you an example for you if they haven't already, because instructors are really good at just talking in general. So this will just be faster. Well, give me a specific example that's applicable to me because it helps. And so my story with this is that I've been trying to get my wife, like, you should check out this generative AI thing. But it resonated. She got it. It made perfect sense. There wasn't really a reason for her to go do it.
Cognitively, it was like,
She
okay.
got it, but there wasn't a reason. And so then fast forward to, we just moved to Florida. And when we were getting ready to move, if you've been through this, you know that you've got to you're trying to work your way through the stuff left in the fridge before you leave.
Oh,
and you got stuff in the pantry and stuff in the fridge, and there's so much stuff, right? And so the one example that finally got her to jump on, create an account, and start using ChatGPT was when I said, well, you could go on there and type, I have the following things in my pantry.
What can I
What
make?
can I make? And it will go find recipes. And then you could say, I don't like that one. Or, oh, I don't have this one needs cumin or not cumin, but like cumin. I
Yeah.
don't have cumin. What else can I make? And it will
Yeah.
keep giving you recipes and based on what you have in your pantry. And so it's that thing where this is the crux of this. The trend that I see is right now with all the noise for the learners out there, make sure that you get specific examples for how this applies to you. So ask the question, ask the instructor so that you get the examples. And for the instructors, make sure that you're giving examples that the person says, I would use that. I would do that. And that's one of the trend. You know, this isn't a new trend. This has been a trend for a long time. However,
No.
the amount of noise has just gotten louder and louder, so that that's the first thing that
It
comes.
goes back to the information over. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I can see that, and I can see where that would be a rising gap, because as the amount of noise rises, as the number of sources we're consuming information from, as just in general, there's a lot of static,
Mhm.
that becomes very, very difficult to sort the wheat from the chaff, because it's just everywhere, and knowing what to do with it, which goes back to really what we were talking about at the very beginning, which is, don't just do things to cram more in. And I see so much content consumption where it's like, I'm just consuming more, I'm bringing in more, I'm taking in more. But if you skip that step of, let me actually take the time to pause,
Yeah.
be still, which sounds counterintuitive to productivity. Like, wait a minute, you want me to stop? Like,
Hmm.
yeah, to be able to think about that. If you don't do that, it's just going to be head knowledge, and you'll be filled with great ideas, but you're not
Yeah.
going to do much with it.
You know, I have one of the ways that has been really helpful for me, and one of the things I teach is, and it came up in my TED talk also, is about if we actually put a number on what your time is worth. So you listening, I have a free gift for you if you want. If you want an estimate of what your time is worth, I'll give you a number. If you go to productivitygladiator.com right now on your phone or computer or whatever, and you scroll down on the first page, there's a section called the time value calculators, and hit the
Okay.
button to calculate the value of your time. And it is a calculator that shows up. I don't require you to give me your email address. This is free for you to use. But if you go in there and type in, you answer like 3 questions, and it gives you an estimate for what your personal time outside of work is worth and for what your work time is worth. And the reason that's helpful is because then when there's all of this noise, if you think, some people have struggled with, well, I want to read that and I want to read that and I want to do this and I want to do this, and that list is forever long. But if you actually had to spend money on it, people sometimes are much more in tune to, is that
I can see
worth
that working really
that?
well. If you slap a dollar per hour amount to that and go,
Yeah.
yeah, but would you spend
Yeah.
that kind of money on that if you knew you had? Then it's like, well, heavens no, I would never do it. It's like, but then why are you? Because that's exactly what you're
Yes.
doing. And time's one of those things you can't get it back. That's the
Right.
difference between that with money. At least money, you can make it back somehow. Time, you can't. Once it's
Right.
gone, it's gone.
The funny example that I had the other day that really irked me. This one came in, it really irked me. I got one of those letters in the mail that says, you're eligible to be part of this class action, whatever, lawsuit
Oh, yeah.
against this big corporation. And you could
Because of
get up
something you did
to,
10 years ago or whatever that you
right,
didn't even realize
something.
you were part of, but
Yeah.
somehow they
And
had your
there's,
information.
now there's a judgment. And so we have this huge pot of millions and millions of dollars, and you could get a good portion of that up to some amount of money. So I got this notice, and now I practice what I preach. So I know that my time is worth, at that, I calculated it at the time at $30 an hour. My
Okay.
personal time is $30 an hour. So to respond to this request for stuff that I had to submit, it's going to take me probably an hour to go back and I have to dig up receipts from I got to be able to prove whatever, but
Yeah,
they
you
were
can't just say,
offering,
yes, I have, and send it
right.
back.
And they were offering $150. You are eligible for probably, up to $150 or something. And so I thought, and I've been a skeptic in the past, but I was like, you know what? It's going to take me an hour of my time. That's $30 of value. And if I get 150 for that, then okay, maybe like this makes sense. That's 5 to 1. Like,
Okay.
all right, we'll try it. And I took a picture of it when it came in. Do you want to know how much money I actually got for that
How
hour
much?
and a half
How
of
much?
time? $5.61. That was my share of the pot. And so, you know what, Christopher? Screw that, man. I am not responding to any class action lawsuits ever again. I learned my lesson because it's not worth my time. So that
I
noise can
love
just
that.
stay noise.
The thing with that though is even going through the process, and I love highlighting this because I talk a lot about being really intentional about what you do. And even taking the time to think about that and think about, okay, how much time is this really going to take? What is the potential return for that time investment? Is this a good use of my time when I think about what's going to come in return? And granted, you were basing your value off what you thought was going to happen. And then it came back
Yeah.
and you learned the lesson of like, well, okay,
Yeah.
lesson learned. If they tell me 150, it's probably going to be more like 5. So unless the number they're telling me is $10 million, I probably am not going to take the time to fill out the form and validate all this stuff and send it back.
Right. And the flip side to that is, and this is my attitude towards social media, is, you know what? I don't get paid to be on social media. Like, it's not consuming social media, right? It's not,
I mean,
that's
if you
not.
really think about it, you're paying them because anything that's free, you are the product. And I think
Mhm.
that's something a lot of people don't think about. If something's free, you're the
What's
product. So
what's
you're
your time
essentially
worth?
paying for your attention and your information by participating in it, which isn't necessarily bad, so
Yeah.
long as you're thinking about the value equation of, is this value transaction worth it?
Totally. It's remembering. And so for me, that's just always been a really easy and helpful metaphor is, all right, you're asking for my time. And I'm a very generous person normally. So my automatic response used to be, oh yeah, what do you need? Yeah, happy to help, happy to help. And now if I also, I'll never forget after that whole TED Talk thing came out, and I was working with an organization, and the woman came up to me after I did the session on time management, and she said, the biggest thing I got out of this is the permission to say no. And it was like, okay, tell me about that. And she said, because she had a friend that was, you have those friends that are like royal leeches. They just suck the life out of you. They don't add to your life. They can't tend to distract from it. And
Yeah,
she came up after and she said, listening to your talk, I have a hard time saying no when this friend would ask me, hey, can we hang out? And what's going to happen when you hang out. It's going to be a lot of bashing. It's going to be a lot of the world sucks, and it's going to just suck the life out of you. But if you don't have anything already on your calendar, you feel guilty saying no. And what was
yeah,
funny is she felt guilty saying no until she knew how much her time was worth and how much that 4 hours cost. And she wasn't going to give that friend $100, but she couldn't say no to the time. But when we put a number on it, that was her permission to say no, was like, you're not worth $100. No, I'm not going to do that. And so not that you should reduce all your relationships into dollar things, but that was just, it's like,
go through your contact list and assign a dollar amount next to
no.
every name in your phone where you're like, well, you know what? Nah, you're not worth my time.
Right. But what's interesting is that's the permit for all the free stuff
Yeah,
that you get thrown at you. That's your permission to say no. Is like, well, how much of my time is this going to take? And am I getting that amount of value from it? And if you are, like, I'm not saying you should absolutely spend your time in the ways that seem the most valuable to you. This is just a helpful
sure.
reference.
No, but I think it's a really good way to help make the intangible tangible, because
Yeah.
we often talk about time and it's this very ethereal,
Yeah.
ambiguous thing. But if you can actually establish, no, your time is actually worth something.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that you hit on there that I think can be extremely valuable for people is there can be a perception that unused time, like, if it's not assigned to something, it's basically, it doesn't hold value. And going back to what we've been saying from the beginning, that actually having that intentional time for stillness, that actually is important. So it actually is just as valuable to have open space for stillness. You can't go, well, I don't have anything else, so I guess I can just fill in the cracks and I'm not really out anything, because you actually are out something by giving that up.
Yeah. Here's a great thought or a tip that we talk about in my life balance sessions is I'm deliberate. Deliberate for me about my me time. And what I mean by that
Okay.
is I hope that you probably already schedule your week in advance. That's pro tip. The title of this session is hacks and strategies. If you're not already planning your weeks in advance, set aside some time. My favorite day is Thursday. Set some time on Thursday, and I plan Thursday through the following Sunday every week on a rotating.
Okay.
Every week, I'm looking 10 days in advance, and I'm looking at the week, and I use my life balance plan that we develop with training, and I look at that. And one of those pieces is I know about myself that I need one weekday night and one part of a weekend day of nothing, like nothing on the
Okay.
calendar, no
You
device.
figured out what your number is.
That's my thing. And I know right now in advance that if I don't get that, by the time I get to next week, I'm going to be feeling the fatigue. I'm going to be feeling some of that life balance feeling, that like, oh God, there's too much going on. I'm running too hard, because that's my recharge time. I'm not even though I am a pretty extroverted person, I actually recharge by not talking and not being around people. So for me, I know that that's the amount of me time that I need. And
Okay.
so I make sure that on the
That's
calendar,
what keeps your battery. That's what keeps your battery at a healthy level.
that's it. And so that's my me time. And so for you, if you don't know what your amount of me time is, and you're not being deliberate about putting that on the calendar and planning for that, then it's going to be a treadmill that you're on constantly of, oh, it's too much. And then you recharge, and then you make up for it with like an entire day, but you didn't necessarily need day. Like and it took me a long time. It took me a couple of years to figure out this is how
I'm
much.
curious on that one because I'm similar. So going back to being very intentional about my time, which with
Yeah,
7 kids and all the things I do, I have to be, because if I don't,
you bet.
there's not
Yeah.
enough hours in the day. But it's one of those things where, similar to you, over the years, I've really had to be very thoughtful and reflective on figuring out what are those things that, recharge me, or how much time do I really need? Because like you said, if it's not enough, you're depleted. If it's too much, at least for me, I end up feeling not productive and I get really frustrated. I start feeling anxious, things like that. So I've got to kind of fine tune what that is and then actually build time into that week. And then if something bumps, I've got to refill it. Like I don't just go, well, I lost that time. It's like, no, I got to actually then move other things to help accommodate that. As you do this and as you work with people, because I think knowing that is probably one of the most critical steps. Because if you don't know what you're shooting for,
Yeah.
it's very hard to get there. How often do people have that figured out? How often when you work with people, do they just go, I know that off the top of my head, I need to do this. I'm just not good at getting there.
Less than 1 in 100 could tell me exactly
Really?
what that number is, because everybody knows that me time is a thing, but most people have not sat down and figured out what exactly that amount is. And
Or
it
what or
comes with
what that
experimentation.
means even, I would imagine. Because it's
Yeah,
one thing to say me time, but me time could be a
right.
lot of things.
And if me time is just laying on the couch scrolling through Instagram, that's might not be the me time that you need. Like that's it. It's a little different depending on the person. And so it's figuring out the parameters around that. And honestly, it takes a little while, but it often just hasn't occurred to people. So once we start talking about it, then they start to look at it, and you start to notice the things. And you could probably sit right now and figure out, okay, if I look back in the last few weeks, when were the weeks that I was feeling charged, and when were the weeks that I was feeling exhausted? And as you plan your week in advance, part of it is reflecting on, all right, how am I doing? Do I feel like I've gotten some downtime? Am I feeling exhausted? Every Thursday I'm checking in with myself and I'm looking ahead and all right, here it is. And so it took a little while to get the exact number. I don't yet have a calculator that can tell, all right, Christopher, here's how many hours of me time you need or something. I haven't got that yet, but
But I think to your point on that one, I don't know that you could create that. You might be able to have something that helps people think through the right questions to ask, the right things to do. But I know I encounter people who are, and this comes back to that imposter syndrome. They're looking at other people going, it should look like that. And it's like, well, if
Yeah.
you're trying to copy somebody else's,
Yeah.
it's probably not going to work very well for you because you're wired completely differently than they are. On top of that, you're only seeing the like highlight reel of their life. So you don't actually know how well that's working for them behind this. Like you really are the only one, or maybe the people closest to you are really the only ones that go, actually, no, if you don't. Like
Right.
my wife was one, she'll be like, you need to get your workout in because if you don't, it messes with I can just tell your attitude, whatever. So I'm very intentional about making sure that I have that time. So
Yeah.
but if somebody tried to copy me and go, well, what's Christopher's day look like? Let me just make my calendar look like that.
Wouldn't work for
You'd
them. Yeah.
probably be miserable.
And, Christopher, figuring out you can get in the ballpark pretty easily by thinking through it. It's funny you asked me that, and I realized, well, when we're trying to figure out what it is for different people, here's the way that you can think about it, and it's think about the extremes. Like for example, if you're on vacation, and how long could you go without talking to anybody and not having anything to do on vacation before you would start to get a little antsy and maybe want to do something? And for some people,
Okay.
that's a long time. And for other people, that's like
Retirement.
a morning. Yeah, right. For some people, that's like maybe the morning, right? The first, by the time if they start their day with nothing, by the time they get to lunch, they're going to be looking on TripAdvisor to see what are the activities around this place that I could do, or so, so like that's
Yep.
a good sort of, all right, what that gets you in the ballpark and gives you sort of a frame of reference on, well, what is that? And same thing with exercise and stuff. How long it's been since the last time you exercised, and when you could probably give a rough ballpark on that, and the answer is somewhere in there, and that gives you a place to start as to try with this.
Yeah. Yeah. No. And I think going back to some of the steps, I can see where if you're working with people and they've been trying to do some of these things and they've jumped straight to the tasks, the do this, do that, but haven't thought first about, hey, let me think about what good looks like for me. I can see where it would fail very quickly because you're doing these things, but you don't really have a purpose or an intention behind it. And so after you've done it a little bit and you don't get that feeling of balance, you're going to kind of go, oh, that didn't work, or you're going to give up
Mhm.
before you really get too far.
And that's step one in the training that we do is the life balance training. It's figuring out what that is. Because you've got to baseline it. You got to have a place to start on where to go. And Christopher, I think you might have dropped off for a second. So
I have no idea. All of a sudden I was back in the main page on there. I'm like, what just happened? I'm sitting here and it took me back to the main. I thought I ended the stream and about freaked out.
Christopher, I
Like,
thought you
what
were
just
like, here,
happened?
Brian, this is so important.
Yeah,
Take a
this
picture.
is
You
so
just
good, Brian. This is so great. I'm just going to improve my productivity because I'm going to go do something else while you finish the stream
right.
for me.
I didn't get my
Wouldn't
workout
that
in.
have been
I'm
the
gonna go
epic?
do
Yeah,
that right
wouldn't
now.
that have been the epic ending? Brian, go ahead and just finish this on your own. I'll be doing other things. No, well, welcome back.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Welcome back, Christopher. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, I got.
Have you ever in the history of hosting yours ever left your guests? I can say I've never done that. So here's a world first for you.
There you go. I'm honored to be your first, Christopher.
Yeah,
I
well,
appreciate that.
I'm glad
I've
you
never,
didn't just close your browser.
I've never upstaged the host so much that they left. Like that's all right.
Yeah. There you go. It was going
Okay.
so well that I was like, my work here is done. I'm just going to hand it over and step out.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Anyway, well, we
Okay.
were talking. One of the things that I do, I think it's important to chat about too on this topic is you alluded to this in the beginning. Let's talk about what do you do with you don't just cram more and more into the day. How do you know what your limit is? Because everybody
Yeah.
has a bandwidth, right? I can teach you
Everybody
all
has a limit.
hacks. You can get email inbox to zero. You can have all of the different tactics for optimizing your time. I can teach you the focus shortcuts and stuff so that you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You're 40% more effective, but there's still a limit. And so just doing more isn't the answer. And so it's to sort of answer that question on and where is it? My answer for that is part of what we have, which is you plan your week in advance, and you know that you need me time on this night. You're going to have time with friends. Like love and relationships is one of the categories of your life balance, and your self
Okay.
stuff, your me time and your workout time. And then there's growth stuff, and there's something for others, something bigger than you that you're involved in. And this is all not work. This is personal stuff, right? Like if you won the lotto, these 4 categories still apply. So
Yeah.
what's that look like? And when you're planning your week, you know that on Tuesday night, it's my time that I get to do, I need the me time then. And if you plan it in advance, then if something does come up at work and you've got, you need to flex because you've got an extra deadline that just dropped in your lap or something, then you can flex it, where you can flex in areas that are open because you haven't already filled those times. I'm not planning your week in advance doesn't mean you plan every minute of every day. I'm not advocating that at all. There should be
No,
open
because I think you can,
times.
again,
Yeah.
because like some of these other things, you can go too far with it and
Yeah.
become so rigid
Yeah.
that, and I see this happen with parents all the time, right? They're new parents and it's like, well, nap schedule's at 1:12. And if we miss it, like the day is shot. And I know you learn a few things by the time you get to number 7. Like
I was going to say, you can
we've
teach
learned
that.
we've learned just not to become too rigid in that, because it actually can be an inhibitor for you where, I mean, the reality is nothing ever goes according to plan. As much
No.
as I plan my day, it never goes exactly as planned. And so if you become too rigid in it, it can actually, I mean, I've seen it throw people into utter chaos when all of a
Yeah.
sudden like this happened and I wasn't planning for it and they just go off the deep end.
Yep. It's starting with a plan. That's the key, right? You start with the plan. So every Thursday I start with a plan. And then by the time I get to Friday, that plan isn't exactly what it was on Thursday. But that's okay because you're adapting. And my favorite, it's that Mike Tyson quote, that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the
Yeah,
mouth. And
everything
that's
goes.
that's the same thing. Like life punches you in the mouth a lot. But
Yeah.
every Thursday I get back on a plan. I get back on a plan. I get back on a plan. And that helps to keep it level. And it also gives you your bandwidth. Cause I know that like, hey, date night is sacred. I don't care what work things are happening. I move them around and I am not available or accessible with my wife for the hours of date night, period. End
Okay.
of story, not negotiable. That's it. And if there was some sort of emergency or something that happened, we could shift date night. But date night is also not negotiable because it's my relationship and my
Yeah.
life and my home life.
And
And
so when you go back to your dollar amount thing, like if you're investing dollars in it, the price just went up on that big time where you go, yeah, that's not something I'm just going to take off because it's priceless.
right. Or you're looking at it and you're like, okay, well, this opportunity just came up at work and I'm going to make, I don't know, $150, $300, $1,000. Is that worth the fight in my relationship and the unease in my relationship and the whatever that could be caused because we can't move date night? Now, there's been times where I've asked my wife, hey, it looks like this date later, I just had this thing come up. This seems like a really good opportunity. Could we shift date night to another night? And if she says no, I say no to that opportunity. But if she says yes, then
Well, because going back to your value, and again, this just is about thinking more holistically about it.
Yeah.
If she says no, and you say, well, I'm doing it anyway, you now have to calculate the cost of the time spent on relational recovery. Because I mean, the argument, the damage, the rebuilding of, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff that when you really think about, okay, so yeah, I got to do this. And then I spent 20 hours cleaning up the mess. If I actually put a dollar amount to that, I'm on a net negative if I actually factor the equation. And not that you can sit and mathematize everything, but in some ways you can, and it can be really helpful in making tangible decisions.
And that right there is part of when we're driving at the question of like, well, all right, so let's say you start using AI and it allows you it frees up some bandwidth for you because it helped with like, oh my God, I just heard the other day there was a teacher, no, a school counselor used to spend their entire fall and spring writing recommendation letters for all their students. There's 400 students, and ChatGPT came out, and now he has a set of prompts where he like, hey, this is the student. Here's a few details about this
Yep.
student,
Here's a
bullet,
few details.
and
Yep.
here write the draft of the letter. And so it went from taking him this much time, a big amount of time, to a smaller amount of time. And so with that bandwidth, you can can he take on more? Yes, he can. But if you already have the structure of, okay, what does my week look like? I can't flex. I can't take on more than what balance looks like for me, because otherwise I'm not going to be a good person. And then I'm just running myself ragged. And so even though there's not a specific answer, I wish I could just tell you, I wish you and I could just determine, sit here and you put our brains together and go, yes, you can work up to X number of hours, and it's not like that. It's a sliding scale for everybody, and it changes. But by starting with a plan for what the balance looks like, and that allows you to kind of fill within that plan.
Okay. So I'm curious on this, because some of the things we've talked about, and you shared that one person who came up to you after hearing your talk, one of
Yeah.
the things she said was, this helps me say no. And I
Yeah.
think saying no is hard for a lot of people.
Oh,
It's
big
hard
time.
for a lot of people to say no to things. I'm curious how you've seen helped people through that, because I understand. I learned at a very early age that saying no is one of the most powerful things, and sometimes it's a fear factor. It's almost
Yeah.
like, oh, but if I say no, the world's going to end. And then after you've said no and you go, hey, everything's fine, you realize, oh, I guess it's not that bad. But how have you helped people with that? Because I can see that being a legitimate concern for people, where they're just like, I just don't know where to start. I mean, I just even think of the example where we started telling our families, we're not coming for holidays anymore.
Yep.
No, we're not. And it's
Yeah.
because of this, and nothing you say is going to change our mind. And it was not a popular decision. But when we did the value equation, it was like, yeah, but how do you help people get to that point?
There's two things I notice here. The first one is people find it easier to say no at home than they do at work, which is totally
Really?
understandable, because at work, it's your paycheck. You can't afford to lose your job. And there's this perception
Mm,
that you can't say no.
okay, I can see that.
So like there's that thing. Whereas your family, even though there could be some conflict, your job is not on the line when you're telling your
Yeah,
family.
they're still going to be there for you, even if you say
Right.
no.
So it's that perceived sort of sense of loss. So that's one interesting thing that I've noticed. But the other thing that's really helpful is when you say no, tell them why in a story. That's a really helpful way to do it. And so one of the things that we talk about in Productivity Gladiator training is like, if you have a to-do list, or my favorite, this just came up in my head the other day. I used to have a manager who had the list of all of the things that the team was doing, all the projects that we were responsible for as a whole team. And
Okay.
then when the big boss came in and said, hey, can you take on this and this? And hey, we've got these two things. Can you take the lead on that? He would turn to him, he would show them the whiteboard and say, well, which of these two things should drop off so that we can take on those
So
two
we
things?
can make space for that.
Because this is the bandwidth, right? And so for you as an individual, when you're telling your boss no, and like, you certainly need to be getting promoted often means you're saying yes. You're being willing to take on stuff. You're going to volunteer for things, and that's good. When you're at a capacity situation, if you just say no, I'm too busy, your
Yeah.
boss is going to wonder
Might
why.
be a CLM.
Right. That's like, yeah, that's not, that's not going to go well.
Especially
Like,
if you do it that way. And I've made
right.
that mistake early in my career, where you're
Yeah.
just like, no, I
Yeah.
can't. And you're like, well, that probably wasn't the best way to handle that situation.
Right. So instead, if it's no, because here is my list of things, here's all my to-dos that I have right now that I have to do. And so where does this fit? Because some of these things might slip. So that it's basically instead of saying no, it's saying yes and help me understand where this fits
Yeah,
in
where
the
this
scheme of
fits in the
things,
mix.
because things are going to drop. And what's not negotiable is your date night and your me time and your outside of work things, like that. You have to stand up for those. So you don't say no, you say yes. And here's the list of all the things I have to do. So I can take that on if you tell me which of these things I can drop
It's
off or
less
can
important.
reassign
Which of
or
these things that I already have on my priorities is less important than what you're asking from me right
yeah.
now.
And if this is a big, if you oftentimes you're going to know whether this is just on a whim, like, hey, can you do this? Or if this is like actually something that's really important to the boss or the organization or that kind of thing. And so the other thing that's really helpful is using a story when you're saying no, as to explain why. If you're trying to explain why, use a story. And so it's a story about your kid has this thing coming up and he's been practicing for months to be the lead in the play or something at work. And so I have to take him to practice, and I got family obligations in the evening because he's been working for months on this. That sounds different than, no, I'm not free
I'm too
on,
busy
I'm too busy on Thursday night, I can't. So if you say why with a story,
contextualizing it.
that's really helpful in
Okay.
those situations.
Okay. I love that. Something I'd add to it that I
Yeah.
think I've seen over the years a lot is a lot of times there's this temptation to immediately respond with a yes or a no before you actually really even understand what's being asked of you. You know, it's like, hey, can
Nice.
you do this? And it's
Yeah.
like, yes or no. Instead of the number of times I've been like, help me understand what it is you're really asking before I do. And I have been blown away in my career how much that has transformed my ability to navigate things, because so often we just have these reactions to things and we don't really even understand what we're reacting. Hey, can you do this? And
Yeah.
I, in my head, have placed, well, I think it's this and I think it's all these other things and da 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 da. And so the reaction can be no, but then you're like, well, help me understand what it is you're thinking. Oh,
Yeah.
you just want me to do this like 30-second, that's it? Oh, I was completely misunderstood. And again, the communication gaps, I
Oh,
cannot tell you how many times. And again, people feel like you're actually taking the time to listen. So going back to the relationship building, instead of somebody feeling like you're either just a yes person or you're always the really difficult person who's always saying no, it's like, well, I'd like to let me understand what you actually are looking for. And honestly, I feel like 99 times out of 100, it is never what I actually thought when I had my initial reaction.
man, Christopher, I love that you mentioned this, because there's two magic, hacks and strategies, right? Here's one, three magic words. Tell me more. When they
I
come
love
to you
that.
and they're like, "Oh, can you do this thing?" "Oh, tell me more about that." Before you respond, it's like you said, the pause, right? Ask them to tell you more. And I use this every time I have an emotional response to something, because you get really pissed off about something, or you're upset, or you're something. And before you catch yourself, I always,
I'm
I've even
still
said it
working
through
on that, by the
I've
way.
said it through gritted teeth sometimes. I've been like, tell me more about that. Let me like breathe while you give me more information, because you don't have enough information to go off based on the offhanded thing that they said. So the first one is tell me more. Those three words, man, awesome. And the second thing is, it's the old begin with the end in mind idea, but it's like, what does success look like for this? Like, what's the outcome that you need here? And it alludes to exactly what you were saying. It's like, tell me more about, what if I'm going to do this, what exactly do I need to, what does success look like for you? Because ultimately, if it's at work, you're trying to do a good job. So what does a good job look like? Like, that's
Yeah.
helpful information.
Well, and get into that success and defining what success looks like. Because I think what I've experienced over the years is a lot of times when people come and ask for something, a lot of times they ask for the tactics. Can you do like this thing? And you're like, well, okay, I know a lot of times getting to the what are you hoping to accomplish with that is
Yeah.
super helpful for me, because especially with me, I normally have probably a different way that I'm thinking about it. And I might be able to get you to your outcome, but it might not look like what you're thinking. And being able to help be like, I think I can get you there, but I might not be able to do it exactly the way you're thinking, but we'll still get the same result. I mean, granted, sometimes that really drives people bonkers because they're like, no, literally, I just want you to do this thing. And then it's like, well, if you're really stuck in the dirt on that, I probably can't help you with this. But if you're really trying to get here, I can help you get from point A to point B. I just am not going to do it in a, stone wagon with square wheels. Like, I'd rather take my Tesla. Thank you.
So true. Oh man. I getting to the end result that works for both of you is definitely something it's oftentimes collaborative, and that's really kind of what you and I are talking about here, is whether you're telling your boss yes and how do I prioritize this or whatever, it's getting to the end result that works for both of you while not sacrificing yourself. And that's the challenge. So to get back to your original question, I find people often can say no in their personal life. Like the woman who came up to me after the session and was like, I'm going to say no to this friend now because my time is worth, like that was really helpful for her. She was not contemplating how she could no, I'll just say no. That's fine. So that was helpful. At work, sometimes it's a yes and a collaboration on, here's what I can do and here's what I can't do. And what's not negotiable is burning yourself out.
Because then you're no good to anybody.
Then you're no good to anybody. Exactly.
I like this comment. This one made me laugh a little bit. So yeah, that's a good. I can neither confirm nor deny such a request. And asking to follow. That's great. That's great. I like that. But again, you got to kind of find your own personal flavor with it. Because again, your personality helps define it. I know I use humor and just jest that sometimes cuts through some of the tension of it along those lines. But yeah, it's an interesting one. So on that one, going back to something you had said earlier, well, the other thing before I transition to this, and this will probably be my last discussion topic, I do feel like when it comes to work, it can be harder, but I've often said this. I feel like everyone at some point should lose their job. And not saying I wish that on everybody, because it's a very devastating experience. But I know for me, that was one of the most helpful experiences in my career, because you got past this fear of, if this ever happens, my world is over. Like, there's no coming back from it. And going through that actually helped curb some of that fear, where I learned, oh, I mean, yeah, it really sucked and it wasn't fun and I didn't enjoy this, but the world didn't end. And I think that helped build some confidence in, no, you still need to be diplomatic. I look back at some of my 20-ish years and go, I can't believe that I didn't run into more, spikes. But I think about that and go, but it did help me go, well, yeah, but at the end of the day, my life doesn't end if this. And so you hold it with a bit of an open hand, which does make it easier to be more reasonable and go, hey, if I do say no, because ultimately this is going to cost me way more than I'm willing to. If you really are working for a boss who goes, I don't care if this kills you, get it done. Maybe if they ultimately do say, you're out of here, you'll live and you might be in a better place on the other side.
Right. And I think, that what you're talking about is the extreme end where you lost your job.
That's the extreme end,
but
which it almost never goes there.
Well, but the thing that people often miss is that, and now I say this, and then we're in an age of layoffs where, it is just over.
They are real.
But oftentimes, some of the people who are afraid to say no are the people who are the top performers or the very good performers. And the difference between good performer and average performer, you actually might still, by saying no, you're not going to drop down to fired just because you said no to this one thing. No. And so but for each individual and each situation is different, right? So knowing how that works with your boss and your boss's boss and your workplace on how do you say no and stand up for your life balance and this kind of thing. Like, you can be more productive. Just because you said no to something does not mean that you are downgraded to fired. Oftentimes, actually understanding what it looks like. And, this is an interesting conversation. If you haven't had this conversation with your boss, I absolutely advocate it, which is have a conversation about generally in a performance review, there's performance metrics. And if it's not already expressly said, have your boss say, all right, someone in my position, tell me what they do at the top level. Tell me what they do at the next level and then at this level. And, we talked about having somebody having applicable examples for themselves. And you'll start to see where it's helpful for you to have the context on what are those different levels, what does
Yeah.
that look like, and have them be explicit for you in your position. What would I look like as an average performer? What would I look like as a above average? What would be top? What would be bottom? And that way you truly know what the spectrum is, because some people are stuck right here, and like that's all there is. And so understanding that breadth
But
is
there's a much broader spectrum. And yeah, again, that pushing back in a productive way is not going to take you from the top of the spectrum to the bottom of the pile. Because when you see the spectrum for as big as it is, you recognize there's more room to flex in there than if it's only this thick. Then yeah, you are going to be a little more nervous that, oh boy, this might really knock me back. And I think to your point on that, um, a lot of the things we've discussed in this conversation, and this does make a huge difference, is how you approach this matters a lot. I mean,
true.
over the years, like I said, I'm surprised at some of the things that I did if I reflect back in my early career years. But I've seen, just from making a lot of mistakes over the years, the way you do it does make a big difference. And my personal experience has been, if you are that well-intended, okay, if you're that difficult curmudgeon, that's a different story. But if you're that well-intentioned person who actually is asking deep, thoughtful questions, trying to understand, really truly has a desire to help,
Yeah.
albeit you want to understand, maybe do things differently, figure out how if you really are genuinely approaching that, my experience has been that actually moves you up the spectrum, because instead of just being that person that I say something, you go off and get it done. But if you really think about it, when you're that person that does that, how often do you go get it done and it's actually done right because you didn't even ask the questions in the first place? You just charge down a path and you end up in that cycle going back to productivity. Now you've wasted 10 times as much of your time because you didn't actually figure out what was needed. And I've actually found it it's counterintuitive, but taking the time to slow down, ask those questions, be more thoughtful, and sometimes say, I don't think that's going to work, or I think we might have to think about that differently, or what's going to move instead to make room for that. I've actually found that's moved me up the scale and made me a more thoughtful partner than, oh, that person's so difficult.
Christopher, how many times have you heard in performance reviews that you need to slow down and take your time and do things correctly? That oftentimes, there, for a lot of the people that are the hustlers out there,
Yep.
you might be listening to this right now going, holy smokes, they said that in my review. And that's because you didn't ask the question about what does the end look like, or you rush through it because there were 15 other things, and so you aren't able to do it correctly. And so that's where the yes and conversation with your boss on, yes, I could take this on, and I have, here's all my other things, so let's find a solution because something's going to drop here. And by having their input in it, and so it's asking those questions and knowing, like just like you alluded to, beginning with the end, like what is the end result that you're going for. That's really helpful. And when you approach it with a yes, and here's my situation if I do that, so help me bring with solutions. And if they're like, well, I just need you to do these extra things too, great. Well, could I offer some alternatives? Or could we have, or let's brainstorm alternatives. I mean, I've had very real conversations with my boss about like that we don't have the bandwidth to keep chasing this thing. So what is there a way that we could do this different, better? Could we outsource it? I mean, my times, if you did the calculator, you know what your work time is worth. It gives you a rough estimate of what
You
your
know what your salary is, and you know how much you make. You actually, I've had that conversation before where you're like, if you really want me spending this amount of money,
Mhm.
we could get this done for significantly cheaper.
I was going to say volunteer to be the one who goes to find the outsourcing, right? Can I get on what Fiverr or Upwork, or I can find freelancer who could do some of this for us, and it would be worth less. It would cost less to have them do it than it would me. Let's
Yep.
have that conversation. And so offering solutions, alternatives, as
Yeah.
opposed to just saying, nope, can't, sorry, curmudgeon, like you said. That, so
Yep.
remembering that, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I think it just goes back to the how you do it makes a big difference, because I've seen people over the years, they think they're doing the same thing and it's not working. And usually, if I spend enough time with them, I'm like, I think it's more in your delivery than what you're doing. I think you're doing the right things. I think your delivery might be where you're getting tripped up.
Yep. Agreed.
Awesome. Well, Brian, I knew we were going to have a blast of a conversation, and we delivered on that. So thanks for all the engagement and participation from those watching. And Brian, always a pleasure when we catch up. Thanks for coming and talking through this in a time when I think people are tired, exhausted, overwhelmed with all the change that's going on. I think it's a perfectly relevant topic for, hey, help make the most of the life you have, because time is limited and how you spend it matters.
Absolutely. And if you want to keep in touch, at Productivity Gladiator is that's Productivity Gladiator is on everything, whether it's Instagram, Facebook,
On
or whatever.
all the things.
All the things. Productivity Gladiator is the brand. If you're interested in the learning, if you're interested in me, I'm Brian Nelson Palmer, and you can look me up on any of the places as well. I'm happy to connect with folks. And more importantly, Christopher, I knew I was going to have a good time chatting with you, but man, there was some laughter. I had a mic drop moment where you signed off in the middle.
It was going so well, I just left midstream.
That was awesome. So thanks very
All
much for
right.
having me. It was a treat to do
Yes.
this.
Well, thanks everybody for watching. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.